Fragments of a Faith Forgotten, by George Robert Stowe Mead. Chapter 1. Some rough outlines of the background of the Gnosis. Preliminary considerations. The familiar narrative regarding the origins of Christianity, which we have all imbibed, as it were, with our mother's milk, may be said to constitute an almost intrinsic element of the consciousness of the Western world. It is inextricably interwoven with our earliest recollections, for it has been impressed upon our nascent consciousness with a solemnity that has effectively repressed all questioning, and it has thereby become the paradigm to which we have grown entirely accustomed. It possesses upon its side that stupendous power of inertia, the profound force of custom, against which but few command the fortitude to struggle. But once let the ordinary individual desire to comprehend more fully the greatest narrative in the world, as all its purveyors assert it to be, and he must inevitably commence this struggle. Previously he has been led to believe not only that the narrative is absolutely unique, but that it is entirely supernatural. In brief, if he analyzes his own understanding of the narrative, he finds it violently divorced from any historical environment, an entity unto itself, standing alone in unnatural isolation. His conceptual tableau possesses no background. The need of a background. Moreover, he will find it exceedingly difficult to reconstruct that background, no matter how industriously he may labor. He may peruse numerous volumes concerning the life and times of our Lord, only to discover that for the most part the environment has been contrived to fit the narrative and its principal features have been extracted directly from it, and, in brief, he does not feel that he has been brought into contact with the natural environment for which he seeks. There are, of course, a select few works that do not partake of this nature, but the general reader seldom encounters them, for they are typically regarded as dangerous and disturbing. But even if we delve deeper into the matter and undertake a specialized study of the history of these origins, with the most extensive of libraries at our disposal, we find that no author has as yet provided us with a truly adequate delineation of the environment, and without this it is impossible to attain a genuine comprehension of the nature of infant Christianity and the full scope of its illumination, and without it we shall never understand its true naturalness and its vast capacity for adaptation to that milieu, the main means to a recovery of the outlines. For if we examine the evidence of the first 2 centuries of our era to apprehend the actual state of affairs, instead of a singular church and a uniform expression of faith, we find innumerable communities and endless modes of expression, communities united in the pursuit of a sacred life and systems striving to articulate the radiance of a divine light. Within many of these communities and their philosophical expressions we discover intimate points of contact with the life and faith characteristic of the finest traditions in universal religion, and a means that will assist us in elucidating the outlines of the background of the origins with a greater degree of confidence than we had previously deemed possible. So far from encountering the sharp divorcement between science and religion which has characterized all subsequent periods of the Christian era up to our present day, it was precisely the boast of many of these communities that religion itself was a science, for they boldly asserted that it was possible to apprehend the matters of the soul as definitively as the matters of the physical body, and so far from limiting the illumination which they had received to the comprehension of the most impoverished intellect, or confining it to the realm of blind faith, they maintained that it had endowed them with the means to formulate a comprehensive world philosophy capable of satisfying the most exacting intellectual scrutiny. Never perhaps has the world witnessed more daring efforts to achieve a resolution to the world problem than those attempted by certain of these mystic philosophers and religioscientists. That their endeavors remain for the most part incomprehensible to the modern mind is partly attributable to the profound imperfection of our historical records, and partly due to the inherent impossibility of articulating in human language the stupendous realities to which they aspired, but nevertheless their heaven-storming ambition, when we can truly apprehend its nature, is a spectacle to compel our admiration and move us to bow our heads before the supreme power which inspired their efforts. The Gnostic schools. They strove for the knowledge of God, the science of ultimate realities, the gnosis of the things that are, while wisdom was their supreme objective, and the sacred mysteries of life their primary study. They were assigned myriad names by those who subsequently dragged them from their hidden retreats to ridicule their efforts and anathematize their doctrines, and one of the specific appellations which they used for themselves, custom has now selected to serve as their current general title. In ecclesiastical history they are now predominantly referred to as the Gnostics, those whose ultimate goal was the gnosis, if indeed that represents the precise meaning, for one of their earliest extant documents expressly declares that gnosis is not the end, for it is merely the commencement of the path, since the true end is God, and hence the Gnostics would more accurately be defined as those who utilized the gnosis as the instrumental means to set their feet upon the way to God. Where to look for their origins? The query that immediately presses itself upon the attention of the historical student is, whence did these individuals originate? Did they emerge suddenly amidst a world completely indifferent to such profound matters? And were they entirely disconnected from antiquity, or had they no predecessors? By no means, for those who so bitterly opposed them, who, boasting themselves to be the sole legitimate inheritors of the illumination of the Christ, in their most vitriolic mood, stigmatized the Gnostics as the firstborn of Satan, may paradoxically assist us in orienting our steps toward the direction where we shall discover some materials upon which to base an answer. In a less vituperative temper, the Church Fathers inform us that the doctrines of the Gnosis are derived from Plato and Pythagoras, from Aristotle and Heraclitus, from the mysteries and initiations of the ancient nations, and not from Christ. Let us then endeavor for a brief interval to follow this lead and delineate some rough outlines of the background of the Gnosis, and we shall then be in a superior position to determine whether or not we append our voices to the hue and cry of the heresy hunters. The nature of the field to be surveyed. In the ensuing discourse we shall attempt only the most foundational indications of the vast field of research in which the student of Christian origins must labor, before he can truly appreciate the nature of the soil wherein the seed was sown. The political history and social conditions of the epoch must be carefully scrutinized and continually borne in mind, but the most crucial domain to be surveyed is the complexion of the religious world, particularly during the 3 centuries preceding our era. How is it possible, we ask ourselves, as we gaze upon the intricate blendings of cults, the syncretism of theogonies and cosmogonies and the amalgamations of faith that proliferated in these centuries, to distill them into their original elements? The dilemma appears as insurmountable as the endeavor to trace the profound intermingling of races and subraces, of nations and families, which constituted the material vehicles for these blendings of cult and religion. Where might we begin? For if we commence at the juncture where documented history fails, and imagine that we have thereby reached a truly primitive state of affairs, we find ourselves compelled to continually revise our hypotheses in light of each subsequent archaeological and ethnological discovery. Tribes that we have long regarded as primitive savages are ultimately revealed to be the decaying remnants of once great nations, while their superstitions and barbarous practices are discovered to be blended with the vestiges of exalted ideas that no mere savagery could have evolved. So where shall we seize upon a definitive beginning amidst this material of protean change? Surely we cannot trace this lineage along the lines of material evolution alone? May it not be that there exists the underlying soul of a people as well, which must also be reckoned with? The soil of the field. Just as the corporeal forms of men are generated from other bodies, so too are nations born from preceding nations. However, if tracing the physical lineage of an individual proves challenging, delineating the heredity of a nation is infinitely more arduous. While a man possesses merely two parents, a nation may lay claim to a multitude. Furthermore, whereas the mortal remains of a person's parents are interred to decompose out of sight, the figurative bodies of nations decay before the eyes of the world, persisting in amalgamation with their descendants and the broader genealogical branches they share with other cultures. Although nations may possess distinct defining characteristics, they are not individualized in the same manner as a human being. Consequently, unraveling the enigma of their inner heredity presents a more formidable challenge than discerning the nature of the animal soul, as it unfolds upon a vastly grander scale. Given the nature of this physical vehicle of collective religious consciousness, it is hardly surprising that the history of the evolution of religious ideas remains one of the most demanding fields of inquiry. Bearing all these presuppositions in mind, attempting any generalization demands the utmost audacity. One senses that every assertion should be accompanied by so many caveats that its inherent crudity becomes almost unpalatable. We recognize that we are merely delineating the bones of a skeleton when we ought to be fleshing them out and rendering them vibrant with life. Let us return, however, to the antecedents of the specific epoch and movement currently under consideration. 3 mother streams. 3 principal streams intermingle their waters within the tumultuous torrent that surges through the lands during these pivotal centuries. 3 primary elements combine their substance and transmute their intrinsic natures within the seething crucible of the early Christian era. Greece, Egypt, and Jewry receive the infant in their arms, suckle the body of the newborn babe, and stand watch about its cradle. Its irrational soul mirrors the animal souls of its nurses, and its rational soul shares a lineage with their intellects. Yet, the spirit residing within it is illuminated by the Christ. It is the lineage of this rational and spiritual soul, however, that warrants our closest attention, for therein lies the esoteric dimension of the faiths of Jewry, Egypt, and Greece. We must, therefore, diligently direct our search toward the spheres where this essence resides. We shall not discover it within the popular cults and lay practices of the masses, but rather in the religion and discipline of the philosopher and the sage, the prophet and the priest. Throughout antiquity, religion encompassed as many degrees as there were gradations in human nature. Instruction in its inner mysteries was strictly reserved for those deemed capable of comprehension. Mystery institutions and initiatory schools of every caliber flourished across all great nations, and it is to these bastions that we must look for the highest expressions of their faiths, and, alas, not infrequently for the most debased as well, since the worst is invariably the corruption of the best. This latter phenomenon, however, we shall address elsewhere. Let us first direct our attention, then, to the religion of the Grecian intellect. Greece, the Greece of 600 BC. If we turn our gaze to the Greece of the 6th century preceding our era, we discern the harbingers of a nascent spirit awakening within the Western world, marking the inception of profound intellectual vitality. It is, metaphorically speaking, the adolescence of the Hellenic genius. Novel cognitive capacities are springing into action, and the archaic myths and ancient oracular wisdom are finding fresh articulation through the infant science of empirical physics and the dawn of philosophy. This burgeoning activity constitutes an integral aspect of a grand quickening, an outpouring of vital power discernible in other lands as well. It represents a profound intensification of the religious consciousness among the nations, one that amplified the religious instinct of Greece in a truly remarkable fashion. Its most salient characteristic is the application of intellect to matters of religion, propelled by the accelerated development of this cognitive faculty in humankind. The foremost pioneers of this movement were individuals whose names endure eternally within the pantheon of fame. In the Far East, we find Confucius and Laozi. In India, Gautama the Buddha. In Persia, the final iteration of the Zoroasters. And in Greece, Pythagoras. Doubtless, there were others elsewhere who served as messengers of the light, yet our extant historical records remain too fragmented to allow us to retrace their paths. Could anyone who trusts in the providence of divine wisdom guiding human affairs doubt that this epoch was but a facet of some magnificent design intended for humanity's advancement? If indeed there is a providence that shapes our destinies, where might its guiding hand be witnessed more clearly than in such monumental occurrences? The precursors of Pythagoras. Confining our focus to Greece, however, we must not suppose that Pythagoras emerged without predecessors. Although his subsequent disciples would have us believe that all philosophy cascaded from him alone, we cannot lend credence to so abrupt a genesis. We hold no doubt that Pythagoras viewed himself merely as an enunciator of ancient truths, and as but a single teacher within a much longer continuum of doctrine. He was preceded by Pherecydes, Anaximander, and Thales in Asia Minor, alongside numerous other preceptors scattered throughout Egypt, Chaldea, and beyond. Indeed, during these formative days, it proves nearly impossible to divorce philosophy from mythology and the myriad archaic concepts entwined with it. When we examine the era of Thales, who is widely regarded as the herald of the foundational elements of philosophy within the Hellenic world, and who lived a century prior to Pythagoras, we encounter a state of affairs resembling the following. The educated and widely traveled Greeks of that epoch esteemed Egypt as the absolute epicenter of all learning and culture, dismissing their own forebears as being of little consequence in such exalted matters. The rhapsodists of the Homeric epics flattered their vanity by regaling them with songs detailing the martial prowess of their ancient heroes. However, they could convey nothing of profound religious substance to the intellectual elite. As for Hesiod, his Theogony and similar works, the learned could extract precious little from them. He was undeniably more intelligible than the archaic fragments of the Orphic poems, which enshrined the most venerable elements of the Hellenic religious tradition. Yet, he fell drastically short of encompassing the profound wisdom of Egypt. Regarding the Orphic fragments, these were widely perceived as mere relics of a barbarous ancestry. None lent them credence save the superstitious and the ignorant. Nevertheless, a nation destined to assert its own unique identity, rather than remaining a mere imitator of others, must harbor confidence in its past traditions. Thus, around this period, we observe the emergence of a burgeoning interest in these ancient fragments, a fascination that gradually spurred their collection and subsequent translation into the vernacular Greek of the era. This endeavor unfolded at the close of the 6th century, and the figure most closely identified with the concerted effort to recover these fragments of the old tradition was Onamacritus. It is particularly fascinating to note that this cultural reclamation occurred just prior to the momentous period when Greece repelled the invading multitudes of Xerxes from European shores. The overarching effort appears to have been an attempt to revive Greece's memory of her own past by excavating the channels of her ancient inspiration. Simultaneously, it sought to empower her with an awareness of the strength inherent in her distinctive genius, reinterpreting the old oracular wisdom through the prism of her burgeoning intellect. Through this synthesis, Greece might summon the courage to hurl back the invading forces of the East, thereby paving the way for her future conquests of those very eastern lands during the reign of Alexander. The Orphic tradition. During this epoch, therefore, we witness both the ascent of philosophy and the resurgence of the Orphic tradition. This, however, does not encompass the whole truth. The transformative leaven was operating as potently within as it was without, culminating in an enormously heightened level of activity among the most sacred institutions of Hellenic religious life, the mysteries. Before we proceed to consider, albeit briefly, what is perhaps the most crucial point of all, let us attempt a rapid retrospection along the trajectory of the Orphic tradition. Indeed, those in later Greece who studied such esoteric matters more profoundly than their contemporaries asserted with a unified voice that their philosophical lineage descended from Orpheus, passing subsequently through Pythagoras and Plato. Primitive Hellas. The Greeks known to history appear to have constituted part of one of the migratory waves of the great Aryan stock into Europe. From this primary wave there undoubtedly diverged numerous smaller wavelets. Should we venture to believe that a seed of historical truth underlies the records of the priests of Sais, communicated to Solon and preserved for us by Plato in his Critias and Timaeus, we learn that as early as 10 millennia before our era, Attica was occupied by the long-forgotten ancestors of the Hellenes. Subsequently occurred the Great Deluge, wherein the Atlantic island was destroyed and the shores of the Mediterranean were rendered uninhabitable by seismic disturbances. This profound cataclysm was but one of many, reputedly the third prior to the flood of Deucalion. This epoch corresponded to the time of Egypt before the flood, which is mentioned in the writings of Manetho. If this be true, one can imagine how the wavelet of the conquering Aryan race that then occupied Hellas, the overlords of the period's autochthonies, was repulsed, and how the territory was left for a protracted duration to the occupation of these very autochthonies, whom Herodotus designates as the Pelasgi. To the Greeks, they were analogous to what the Dravidians were and remain to the Indo-Aryans. Autochthonies, perhaps, yet possessing an extensive history of their own, if only their records could be recovered. The polity of the ancient Greek inhabitants of Attica, according to Solon's notes, bears a striking resemblance to that of the ancient Aryans in India. Undoubtedly, their primitive religious traditions derived from a common lineage. As for the Pelasgi, who can ascertain their traditions, or the racial blendings that had transpired before their remnants could be classified as an indiscriminate mass? We are informed that they were governed by chieftains from the Atlantic island, who vigorously extended its conquests to the most distant shores of the Great Sea, and that the ancient Hellenes contested for lordship against this dominant race. What immense possibilities for cult mixtures, the blending of myths, and theocrasia are presented here. It was these Atlanteans who introduced the cults of Poseidon and Hephaestus, Vulcan, the formidable powers of the sea and of subterranean fire, which had destroyed their forebears. For the Aryan Hellenic stock, there existed the All-Father Zeus and the goddess of wisdom Pallas Athena, who was also a martial deity, as befitted a warlike race. What the Greek religion truly entailed during this period, who can definitively say? Yet it is not entirely speculative to suppose that it may have possessed a bardic nature, consisting of hymn bursts suited to warriors. Relics of such a tradition can be found in the legends of the Druid and the Bard, in all the ancient traditions of the Celt, in the mythology of the Teuton and the Norsemen, and even in the legendary lore preserved by the ancient Slavs. The wavelets of Aryan immigration. We may imagine how, in those early years, as the strong current of the Aryan flood swept them onward, wavelet overlapped wavelet, horde battled with horde, and the smiling land of Hellas stood as a rich prize for the strongest. We might envision how, when the effects of the floods had subsided and the seismic disturbances had gradually diminished over the course of many, many years, the Hellenic stock reoccupied the land once again, not only in Greece itself but also along the shores of Asia Minor. Yet, who can determine how many wavelets of immigration flowed in prior to Homeric times? Perhaps someday it may be possible to sift a deposit of historical truth from the myths, perceiving how figures such as a Cecrops, an Erechtheus, and an Ion did not succeed one another in rapid succession, but were rather great leaders who established kingdoms separated by vast expanses of time. May it not further be considered that, alongside these conquering kings, came bards to advise and encourage, supplying whatever religion was deemed suitable for them? Might we not seek the prototype of Orpheus here, and trace the archaic fragments of the most ancient religious poems to one of the later wavelets? One can almost envision some religious pageantry of the era proceeding down the sacred way to Eleusis, ever the most sacred site in Greece, with an Orpheus of the time rousing the warriors to enthusiasm through his songs. Harp in hand, with his gray locks streaming in the breeze, he played while the measured march of the warriors kept time to the strain, emphasizing the rhythm with the clashing of their shields. The Orphic line. It would be futile to search for an intellectual presentation of religion along this lineage. Whatever form it took, it must have been inspirational, prophetical, and oracular. Indeed, this remains the peculiar characteristic of the Orphic tradition. Yet even in those early days was the tradition a pristine one? Scarcely. The various tribes must have fought their way through other races, settling among them for a time before reaching Hellas, and the principal route of their march appears to have skirted the southern shores of the Black Sea and proceeded through Thrace. In Thrace, they would have encountered the cult of Dionysus and absorbed certain of its traditions. This is not to suggest that Thrace was the ancestral home of this cult. Rather, its origins appear to reach eastward and backward into antiquity, a widespread cultus with its roots embedded in the soil of an archaic Semitism, the traces of which are difficult to discern within the obscure and fragmentary records we currently possess. Moreover, there exists some amalgamation of the Chaldean tradition within the Orphic line, though whether it was present during this period or superadded later is difficult to determine. The precise nature of the religion practiced by the earlier of these successive wavelets, once they had settled in the fertile lands of Greece and become more civilized, can no longer be articulated as no records survive. Nonetheless, they were undoubtedly watched over, receiving sufficient inspiration to meet their spiritual needs. The Greece of Homer. If we now turn to the Greece of Homer and attempt to locate traces of Orpheus, we are doomed to disappointment. However, this absence is not entirely inexplicable. Homer sings of a Greece that appears to have completely forgotten its ancient bards, of heroes who had, so to speak, left their religion at home. The fair-haired Greeks, who achieved supremacy subsequent to Ion's era, were a people who paid little heed to religion. They convey the impression of being akin to Viking warriors, caring little for the agricultural pursuits in which their predecessors had been engaged, if we are to judge by the tradition preserved by Hesiod. We observe a multitude of independent chieftains occupying the numerous valleys of Greece, whose method of providing for a burgeoning population relied upon foray and conquest. While there may have been a fickle Hellen and an overly gallant Paris who violated the hospitality of his hosts, the Trojan War was more likely a foray undertaken by these warriors to acquire new territories. It was a campaign directed not against an alien race, but against their own general kin. For the Trojans were Greeks, somewhat orientalized in their customs, perhaps owing to their settlement in proximity to the nations of Asia, yet Greeks nonetheless. They were dark-haired Greeks who maintained a cult similar to that of the fair-haired tribes, and who, perchance, possessed just as little profound understanding of it. However, it is precisely this absence of the priest, or the markedly subordinate position he occupies, that indicates the germ of independent thought. This independence became the defining characteristic of the Greek mind as it subsequently developed, and historical Greece served as its special and carefully guarded depository, ensuring it might evolve toward the world purpose for which it was destined. It was salutary for men to look the gods manfully in the face, and to battle against them if the need arose. Homer was the bard of these Viking-like heroes, but the bard of their predecessors, the Hellenic stock whom they had dominated, was Orpheus. The descendants of the Trojan heroes naturally looked to Homer as the bard of their forefathers' deeds, as well as the chronicler of their customs and cults. Possessing too much pride to heed Orpheus and the ancient theologians who had served as the poets of the conquered, they relinquished the archaic songs and sagas of this bardic lineage, the lays and legends of an older Greece, to the common populace, thereby condemning them to subsequent neglect and incomprehension. Orpheus returns to Greece. Such was the state of affairs when philosophy first emerged in the 7th century. At that juncture, a discerning few realized that Homer could no longer satisfy the religious requirements of intellectual men. There was nothing within the Homeric epics comparable to the profound religious traditions of Egypt and Chaldea. To all appearances, the Greeks possessed no true religion, and their ancestors were mere barbarians. It then occurred to certain scholars to collect and compare the ancient oracles and religious myths of the populace, alongside the remnants of the Orphic songs. Within these texts, they discovered evidence of an ancient Greek tradition concerning the unseen world, a tradition that could bear favorable comparison with the vast wisdom imparted by Egypt and Chaldea. Greece indeed possessed a religious heritage. Their forebears were not barbarous. We may safely surmise that those who occupied themselves with such inquiries during this critical epoch were not bereft of guidance. Poets and thinkers alike received assistance to the extent of their capacity to comprehend it. The surviving fragments of this endeavor in Orphic poetry exhibit unmistakable signs of such inspiration. We refer here not to the later Orphic hymns, some 80 in number, which may be consulted in Thomas Taylor's English translation, but rather to the archaic fragments dispersed throughout the treatises of classical and patristic authors. Many of these compositions were predicated upon the archaic fragments of the pre-Homeric era, looking back to this primeval tradition as their ultimate foundation. However, the mystic and mythological framework of these poems, along with their ecstatic and prophetic nature, though entirely sufficient for many, proved unsuitable for the nascent intellectuality of Greece that was then asserting itself with unprecedented vigor. Consequently, the foremost leaders of that intellectual movement sought methodologies to clothe the ideas enshrined in myth and poetry in a guise more amenable to the intelligentsia of the age, thereby giving rise to the philosophy of Pythagoras and subsequently that of Plato. The mysteries, yet, Alongside the public cults and popular traditions, there existed an inner organism of religion and channels of esoteric knowledge concealed within the mystery institutions. If it is challenging to form a precise conception of the evolution of popular religious ideas in Greece, it is profoundly more difficult to trace the diverse lineages of the mystery traditions. These were regarded with the utmost reverence and guarded with the strictest secrecy, for the slightest violation of the initiatory oath was punishable by death. The fundamental concept underlying the mystery tradition in Greece was analogous to the principles governing all such institutions throughout antiquity, and it is exceedingly rare to encounter any major cult devoid of this esoteric dimension. Within these institutions, specifically within the innermost sanctuaries of the temples, one could discover the means for a more intimate participation in the cultus, alongside explicit instruction in its dogmas. The institution of the mysteries remains arguably the most compelling phenomenon in the comparative study of religion. The prevailing conviction of antiquity maintained that religion encompassed specific knowledge to be attained, secrets or mysteries into which an individual might be initiated. It posited a gradual process of unfolding within spiritual matters. In short, it affirmed the existence of a science of the soul, a genuine knowledge of the unseen. A persistent tradition associated with all the great mystery institutions asserted that their respective founders were the purveyors of all civilizing arts. They were either gods themselves or had been directly instructed by the divine. In brief, they were beings of vastly superior knowledge compared to any who followed them, serving as the exalted teachers of an infant humanity. Not only did they impart the practical arts, but they also instructed early mankind concerning the nature of the gods, the human soul, and the invisible realm, expounding upon the genesis of the cosmos and much besides. Their corruption. We find the ancient world thoroughly honeycombed with these institutions. They varied substantially in character, ranging from the purest and most noble to the most deeply degraded. Within them, we observe both the highest aspirations of religion and the basest superstitions of humanity. This should elicit no surprise. When human nature is intensified, not only are its finer qualities stimulated, but its darker elements are simultaneously afforded greater scope. The impartation of knowledge invariably yields power, and it depends entirely upon the moral character of the recipients whether they wield it for good or for ill. The spiritual teachers of humanity have perennially been opposed by the innate forces of selfishness, for evolutionary progress is exceedingly slow, and mankind remains fundamentally wayward. Furthermore, humanity cannot be coerced into enlightenment. Men must approach it of their own volition, as love is the ultimate fulfillment of the law. Thus, it remains true that although many are called, few are chosen. The reason of it. It is postulated that these earliest teachers of mankind, who established the mystery institutions as the most efficacious vehicle for instructing an infant humanity in higher truths, were souls belonging to a humanity far more highly developed than our own. The men of our nascent race were effectively children, possessing minds but scarcely developed, capable only of comprehending that which they could distinctly perceive and feel. In those primitive epochs, according to this perspective, the mysteries were conducted by individuals who possessed a profound knowledge of natural forces, an acquisition of a prior, perfected humanity that was not necessarily earthborn. The wonders manifested within these rites were of such a magnitude that no member of our current humanity could have produced them independently. As time progressed and our humanity increasingly developed the faculty of reason, deemed finally resilient enough to stand upon its own merit, the exalted teachers gradually withdrew. Consequently, the mysteries were entrusted to the stewardship of the most advanced pupils of this earthly humanity. These successors were ultimately compelled to substitute symbols, devices, sacred dramas, and scenic representations in place of the profound truths that had previously been revealed through higher, direct means. It was during this transition that corruption inevitably crept in, and mankind was left to forge its own divinity through self-conquest and a persistent struggle against the baser elements of its nature. The original teachers remained unseen, ever ready to render assistance. Yet they no longer moved visibly among men to command their reverence and worship. Thus runs the tradition, the various traditions. If, as we have previously observed, the origin and evolution of the popular cults of Greece are exceptionally difficult to trace, the genesis and subsequent development of the Greek mystery cults present an even more formidable challenge. The defining characteristic of the mysteries was the profound secrecy in which their traditions were shrouded. Consequently, we possess no adequate primary materials upon which to base a definitive study, compelling us to rely predominantly upon subtle hints and veiled allusions. This much, however, remains certain. The esoteric facet of religion constituted an initiation into its most exalted cultus and doctrine. The highest praise was bestowed upon the mysteries by the greatest Hellenic thinkers, who attest that these rites purified human nature, not merely inspiring men to lead more virtuous lives on earth, but also enabling them to depart from this world with far brighter hopes for the hereafter. It is unnecessary to speculate within this preliminary outline regarding the precise nature of the primitive mystery traditions descending through the Orphic, Dionysiac, and Eleusinian lineages. Nevertheless, as we descend to the era of Plato, we encounter established mystery institutions that may be broadly categorized as political, private, and philosophic. The political mysteries. The political mysteries, which is to say the state mysteries, were the celebrated Eleusinia, renowned for their magnificent external pageants and their splendid inner rites. During this period, virtually every respectable citizen of Athens was initiated. One can readily deduce that the requisite trials could not have been exceedingly stringent, given the sheer multitude of individuals admitted each year. Indeed, these state mysteries, although facilitating one or several grades of advancement along the path of righteous living and the proper comprehension of life, had grown somewhat perfunctory, as all facets of a state religion are destined to become over time. The private mysteries. Alongside the Eleusinia, there existed certain private mysteries that remained unrecognized by the state. The number of these subsequently proliferated to such an enormous degree that virtually every variety of Oriental mystery cultus found adherents in Greece, as may be observed from a study of the Hellenic religious associations known as Thiasai, Erani, and Origins. Naturally, among private communities and societies of this nature, numerous undesirable elements were to be found. Nevertheless, they simultaneously satisfied the profound needs of many who could derive no spiritual nourishment from the state religion. The Orphic communities. Among these private foundations were communities of rigid ascetics, both men and women, who dedicated themselves entirely to holy living. Such individuals were said to live the Orphic life and were generally known as Orphics. Undoubtedly, there were charlatans who parroted them, falsely laying claim to their purity and knowledge. However, our present focus remains upon the indications provided by those whose conduct truly accorded with their professions. These Orphic communities appear to have served as sanctuaries for those who yearned for the religious life, and among them were the Pythagorean schools. Pythagoras did not establish something entirely unprecedented in Greece when he founded his famous school at Crotona. Rather, he cultivated an already existing tradition. Consequently, when his original school was disbanded and its members were compelled to flee, they sought refuge among the Orphics. The Pythagorean schools thus disappeared into the Orphic communities. It is within the Pythagorean tradition that we observe the signs of what I have termed the philosophic mysteries. Therefore, it is in the finest of the Orphic and Pythagorean traditions that we must uncover indications concerning the nature of the genuine mysteries, rather than in the political Eleusinian or within the disorderly elements of the Oriental cults. The philosophic mysteries. In truth, the Orphics did much to ameliorate the Eleusinian, supporting them as an essential means of educating the ordinary individual toward a comprehension of the higher life. It stands to reason, however, that the mysteries capable of satisfying the lofty aspirations of Orphics and Pythagoreans were of a somewhat more exalted order than the state mysteries provided for the common citizen. These Pythagoreans were renowned throughout antiquity for the purity of their lives and the loftiness of their aims. The mysteries they regarded with such profound reverence must have constituted something far beyond the Eleusinian, a sanctum to which the Eleusinian served merely as one of the outer approaches. Pythagoras and Plato. We must, therefore, seek the innermost religious life of Greece in this direction, bearing in mind that the inner experiences of this existence were kept a profound secret and never publicly paraded. Pythagoras is said to have been initiated into the Egyptian, Chaldean, Orphic, and Eleusinian mysteries. Concurrently, he stood as one of the principal founders of Greek philosophy. His philosophy, however, did not exist as an isolated entity, but rather as the application of his intellect, especially his mathematical genius, to the most superlative elements within these mystery traditions. He recognized the necessity of guiding the rapidly evolving intellectuality of Greece along its own natural trajectories toward the contemplation of the inner nature of things. Otherwise, intoxicated by the joy of its newfound freedom, it would become entirely unmanageable and ultimately reject the truths of the ancient wisdom. Plato continued this endeavor, albeit along somewhat different lines. He engaged more directly with the wider world than did Pythagoras, and his primary effort was to clear the ground of misconceptions, thereby ensuring that the intellect might be purified and rendered fit to contemplate the things that are. He devoted his life to this undertaking, not so much constructing a rigid system of knowledge as meticulously clearing the path, so that the great truths of the gnosis of things that are, as Pythagoras termed it, might become self-evident. It is erroneous to suppose that Plato formulated a distinctly novel system of philosophy. His foundational conceptions were part and parcel of the venerable wisdom handed down by the seers of the mysteries. Yet, he did not merely formulate them, but rather utilized his dialectical method to prepare the philosophical ground, ensuring the mind was in a proper state to receive them. Consequently, the conclusions of his dialogues are nearly always negative. Only at the end of his long life, likely against his better judgment and yielding to the importunity of his pupils, did he produce a positive document in the Timaeus, compiled from fragments of the unpublished writings of Pythagoreans and others. Unfortunately, the majority of those who immediately succeeded him presumed that his dialectical method was an end in itself. Thus, rather than living a life of philosophy and seeking the clear vision of true initiation, they degenerated into vacuous argumentation, culminating only in negation. Aristotle and skepticism. Aristotle followed with his admirable method of analysis and the exact observation of phenomena. Because he concerned himself with the without rather than the within, he was, from one perspective, better understood than Plato, However, from another vantage point, he was even more profoundly misunderstood, as his method, too, was adopted as an end in itself rather than as a mere means. And so we arrive at the 3 centuries preceding the present era, an epoch when the intellectual life of Greece was centered in Alexandria. This was a far more expansive Greece than the Hellas of Plato. It was a Greece whose physical prowess had conquered the Orient, and which proudly boasted that its intellectual vigor would soon conquer the world. Everywhere, it pitted its formidable intellect against the ancient East, and for a time, it harbored the illusion that victory was assured. Its fierce independence of thought had given rise to innumerable, mutually antagonistic schools, offering a spectacle remarkably similar to that of modern Europe over the past 3 centuries. We observe at work there, albeit on a smaller scale and in germ, as it were, the selfsame intellectual activity that has characterized the rise of the modern scientific method. Alongside it, we witness an identical dissolution of traditional paradigms, the same prevailing unrest, and the very same spirit of skepticism. If we were to look merely at the surface of things, we might be tempted to conclude that Greece had entirely forgotten the mystery tradition, glorying solely in the unaided strength of her own intellect. But if we gaze deeper, we shall discover that this was by no means the case. In the days of Plato, the Orient and Egypt were brought to Greece, so to speak, whereas in later times Greece ventured to Egypt and the East. East and West. The ancient wisdom found its home in Egypt, Chaldea, and the Orient generally. Thus, while the Orphic and Pythagorean communities of Plato's era imported a modified Orientalism into Greece, adapting it to the Hellenic genius in accordance with their own ancient wisdom tradition, when thousands of Greeks subsequently ventured into the East, those who had been adequately prepared through contact with these schools achieved a closer intimacy with the ancient wisdom of the Orient, drinking it in with eager readiness. As for the general populace, just as the introduction of Orientalism into Greece precipitated abuses and enthusiastic rites of an unsavory character, even as it simultaneously intensified religious life and offered greater satisfaction to spiritual emotions, so the Greek conquest of the Orient disseminated a spirit of skepticism and unbelief, even while it sharpened their intellectual faculties. Nevertheless, all of this unfolded as a highly gradual process. As skepticism increased, the yearning of countless individuals to withdraw from the warring clash of opinions intensified, driving them to seek refuge in a contemplative life that promised them true knowledge. Oriental thinkers and mystics underwent Hellenization in accordance with Pythagorean and Platonic philosophy, while Greek philosophers were correspondingly Orientalized through contact with members of the multitude of communities that honeycombed not only Egypt and the remainder of the barbarian nations subject to Greece, but also Asia Minor and even Hellas herself. The sheer multitude of these communities during the 1st century is evidenced by an examination of the writings of Philo-Judaeus and the life of Apollonius of Tyana. It is further illuminated by the portrait of mystic Greece that may be reconstructed from the ethical and theosophical essays of Plutarch, as well as from the numerous recently discovered inscriptions detailing the innumerable religious associations throughout Greece. Rome. When the Greek kingdoms of the successors of Alexander were subsequently humbled beneath the conquering might of Rome, the organizing Italic genius proceeded to police the world, in a manner somewhat akin to the current British occupation of India. The legal intellect and practical genius of Rome were never truly at home amid the metaphysical subtleties of Greek philosophy or the mysticism of the East. In literature and art, she could merely imitate Greece. In philosophy, she sought a rule of conduct rather than a comprehensive system of knowledge. Consequently, we observe her, through the persons of her most distinguished men, as an adherent of Stoic naturalism, which encapsulated its ethical code in the ideal of Honestas, the mysteries of Mithras. Nevertheless, Rome could no more evade religious contact with the East than Greece had, and we find her undergoing similar experiences, albeit in a considerably more modified form. The principal point of intersection among the diverse religions of the Roman Empire lay in the shared worship of the sun, and from approximately 70 BC onward, the esoteric core of this immensely popular cult resided in the mysteries of Mithras. The veneration of Mithras, or the sun god, emerged as the most prevalent of the heathen cults, serving as the principal antagonist of the truth throughout the first 4 centuries of our era. Such is the assertion of one who examines the matter from the perspective of a Christian ecclesiastic. Indeed, the Church Fathers, from the time of Justin Martyr onward, declared that the devil, through the mysteries of Mithras, had plagiarized their most sacred rites by way of anticipation. The Mithriac mysteries constituted the esoteric dimension of a vast international religious movement, a phenomenon rendered possible by the unification of diverse peoples within the Greco-Roman world, which arose from the contact between Greece, Rome, and Eastern thought. National and local cults were gradually shaped by the symbolism employed within the modified Chaldeo-Persian tradition. The veneration of the spiritual sun, the logos, alongside the natural emblem of the glorious orb of day, which was ubiquitous in one form or another across all great cults, together with the remainder of the solar symbolism, progressively permeated the popular indigenous forms of religion. In the course of time, Mitra, the visible sun to the uninitiated, yet the spiritual sun and the mediator between light and darkness to the instructed, as Plutarch observes, cast his rays to the uttermost limits of the Roman Empire. Just as his exoteric cult dominated the more restricted forms of national worship, the tradition of his mysteries concomitantly modified the mystery cults of the ancient Western world. Egypt, the wisdom of Egypt. Let us now direct our attention to Egypt and cast a glance over the vista that must be surveyed before the contours of this portion of the background of the Gnosis can be fully delineated. Notwithstanding her reserve and immeasurable contempt for the upstart Greek genius, Egypt had imparted her wisdom to Greece even during the era of the earliest Ptolemies. There had occurred a tremendous undertaking in the translation of records and documents, the origin of which is inextricably associated with the name of Manetho. It is highly probable that Plutarch, in his treatise on the mysteries of Isis, drew the bulk of his information from Manetho. Furthermore, it is patently evident that the doctrines set forth therein as the traditional wisdom of Egypt possess innumerable points of contact with the Greek Trismegistic literature, those mystic and theosophical treatises that served as the manuals of instruction within the inner Hermetic schools. These mystic communities transmitted the wisdom tradition of Thoth or Tahuti, the god of wisdom, whose name, as Jamblichus informs us, was shared by all priests. That is to say, he was the font of inspiration for the wisdom tradition across all its branches. The Greeks, discovering within their own Hermes certain points of similarity with the attributes of Tahuti, bestowed that name upon him, appending the title Trismegistus, or thrice greatest, in recognition of his profound wisdom. The fact that the substance, if not the form, of the oldest treatises within this Trismegistic literature was predominantly Egyptian is further corroborated by Jamblichus in his treatise on the mysteries of the Egyptians and Chaldeans. Following these lines of intersection between Egypt and Greece, we may proceed to examine Egyptian wisdom upon its native soil. Therein we discover many fully developed doctrines which, absent this investigation, we might have presumed to be entirely indigenous to purely Christian ground. Indeed, within the Trismegistic literature, we encounter a number of the distinctive doctrines of Gnostic Christianity, albeit devoid of the historical Christ. All of these doctrines are revealed to have existed for millennia prior within the direct Egyptian tradition, most notably the concepts of the Logos, the Savior and Virgin Mother, the second birth, and the ultimate union with God. The blendings of tradition. However, do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.